There are rooms where the moment you step inside, you can feel that time stopped here long before you were born. The storage room behind Khai's grandfather's pawn shop was a room like that. Khai was 29. He had inherited the pawn shop 3 months earlier after his grandfather passed away from old age. A death so quiet, the whole family barely had time to grieve before returning to their daily routines. He didn't remember much about his grandfather. The old man had died when Khai was still young, and the few memories he had were of quiet Tet dinners where his grandfather sat eating slowly, saying little. Khai's father rarely spoke of him either, and whenever someone brought him up by accident, he changed the subject quickly, as if the question burned his hands. Khai decided to expand the business. The old shop now had a lending app attached to it, using the 50-year-old name to advertise trust and reliability. People borrowed money through their phones now, no face-to-face meetings, no signatures on paper. The system approved automatically, sent reminders automatically, issued late penalty notices automatically. Khai was proud of it. He thought he was modernizing something old. That afternoon, he went down to the storage room to clean it out, preparing the space to become his own office. The room sat behind the display cases of gold and jewelry, a narrow space with no windows, lit by a single yellow bulb hanging from the ceiling, the light so weak the corners stayed in permanent, dim shadow. The first smell that hit him when he opened the door was old paper mixed with something else harder to name. The smell of ink dried decades ago, faintly damp, and underneath that, a thin metallic tang like oxidized copper. The smell of old coins left untouched in a sealed cabinet for years. He stood at the door for a moment, breathing it in, then stepped inside. Wooden shelves lined both walls, packed with forgotten objects. A few pendulum clocks that had stopped ticking decades ago. A chipped tea set, cheap jewelry mixed in cardboard boxes whose corners had rotted soft. Unclaimed, pawned items, forgotten across generations of shop owners. Khai pulled box after box out, sorting through them. Anything still worth something he kept aside, anything ruined he set apart to throw away. The work was tedious, repetitive. The rustle of paper, the clink of objects against each other, the old ceiling fan creaking above his head. Near the end of his work, as the light outside began to dim through the door crack, Khai pulled out a small wooden crate buried deep in a corner, hidden behind a standing cabinet with a broken hinge. The crate was thick with dust, as if no one had touched it in many years. Inside, under a layer of old burlap, were ledgers. Dozens of handwritten account books, the kind people used before computers, hardback covers, thread-bound spines, paper yellowed with age. Khai flipped through a few. Neat handwriting, columns of numbers, names, dates carefully recorded. The shop's income and expenses across decades. And at the very bottom, set apart from the rest, was a black-covered notebook. Unlike the others, its cover wasn't ordinary hardback, but seemed wrapped in some dark, slightly rough fabric, worn at the corners enough to reveal a dark brown lining underneath. The notebook was locked shut with a small metal padlock, rusted with time, gone reddish-brown like dried blood. No key came with it in the crate. Khai picked it up. It was heavier than it looked, heavier than its size should allow, as if there was more inside than just paper. He shook it gently. Something inside shifted with a faint clatter, not the sound of paper. He brought the padlock close to his eyes to examine it. The rusted metal had eaten away most of its original shape, leaving only the crude outline of an old lock. He tried pulling it, twisting it. The lock didn't budge. His phone buzzed in his pocket. a notification from the app announcing a new loan automatically approved. Khai glanced at the screen, then back at the notebook in his hand. He set it on the shelf above, intending to come back to it once he had more time. He didn't know that from that moment on, the notebook had stopped being just an inert object sitting in a dark corner.
A few weeks later, Khai's online lending business had clearly become profitable. The number of borrowers grew steadily each week. The system ran smoothly, automatically approving applications based on simple criteria, automatically sending repayment reminders at the same time each day, automatically calculating interest by the minute past deadline. Khai was pleased. He called his father to share the good news, his voice bright with excitement, talking about revenue, new customers, the idea of opening a second branch. The line went quiet on the other end longer than usual. Khai thought the call had dropped. He asked, "Are you still there?" After a moment, his father spoke, his voice slower and heavier than usual. "Be careful with this line of work, son." Khai asked what he meant by careful. His father didn't answer that. He only added one more sentence, then hung up quickly, as if afraid saying more would be a mistake. "Run things honestly, son." Khai stood holding his phone for a moment, looking at the dark screen. He brushed off the uneasy feeling, telling himself his father simply worried too much, the way old people often did, assuming big success always invited misfortune. He went to sleep that night as usual, not thinking much about the call. That night, Khai had a dream. In the dream, he was lying in his own bed, in his familiar room, but something was different. The light in the room was dimmer than usual, tinted a faded yellow like old oil lamplight instead of electric light. Someone was standing at the foot of the bed. Khai couldn't make out the face clearly, only a tall, thin figure wearing dark, old-fashioned clothing, standing still, arms hanging at the sides. The figure said nothing for a long moment, just stood there, looking down at Khai. Then from that shadow, a voice rose, not loud, not harsh, but carrying a strange weight in every syllable, as if each word carried decades of accumulated pressure. "Pay it back in full." Khai woke with a start. He lay still in the dark for a moment, heart racing, trying to remember the dream. But the details began fading the moment he opened his eyes, the way dreams usually dissolve. He only retained a vague memory of someone standing at the foot of the bed and a short sentence he wasn't sure he remembered correctly. "Pay it back in full," or maybe, "That's enough." He wasn't sure anymore. Khai sat up, drank a sip of water, checked the clock. 3 in the morning. He lay back down, pulled the blanket up, tried to fall asleep again. The uneasy feeling remained, faint, like a grain of sand caught in a shoe that one doesn't bother stopping to remove. The next morning, Khai woke as usual, went to work, checked the system, replied to customer messages. He didn't mention the dream to anyone, not out of deliberate concealment, simply because it had already sunk beneath the weight of other busy matters, like a pebble dropping to the bottom of a pond, sinking slowly, disappearing. The following days passed normally. Khai stayed busy with work, met with partners, reviewed revenue reports. His life continued in its familiar rhythm. The black notebook remained still on the shelf in the storage room, under the weak yellow light, its rusted lock still sealed shut. No one touched it for 2 full weeks. But it did not forget Khai. 2 weeks after the call with his father, a client logged in the system as DVT fell 12 days behind on a loan payment. Khai didn't handle debt collection directly.
He hired an outside team, working through a separate group chat, reporting progress daily. Friday night, the group chat showed a new notification. A short message from the regional manager. Case handled. Attached was a photo. Khai opened it out of reflex without thinking. A motorcycle accident scene, hastily photographed on a phone, lit by yellow streetlight mixed with the red and blue flash of an ambulance in the distance. A crowd stood gathered around the center of the incident, everyone turning to look. Khai started to close the image, but something made his fingers stop on the screen. At the edge of the photo, in the darkest area, almost blending into the shadow of the roadside trees, was a faint, dark smudge. Khai brought 2 fingers to the screen and pinched outward. The image zoomed in. The picture began breaking into small, square pixels, and at near maximum zoom, those pixels rearranged themselves in his eyes into a shape. A man. Standing tall, straight, wearing dark, old-style clothing. The figure stood still amid the bustling crowd at the accident scene, not turning toward the ambulance like everyone else. Instead, looking directly into the camera lens. Khai felt a slow, clear chill run down his spine, like someone had pressed a cold stone along the length of his backbone from neck to waist. He sat up straight in his chair, his heart beating 1 extra beat. He tried to remember. Then the dream from the week before surfaced in his mind, faint but clear enough to match the image in front of him. The figure at the foot of the bed. The same posture, the same heavy silence. Khai closed the app, set the phone face down on the table. He sat still for a moment in the dark room, only the small desk lamp casting light into one corner, listening to the ceiling fan turning steadily overhead. He told himself it was just imagination, drawing shapes out of random pixels. He'd read somewhere that the human brain tends to find faces, find human shapes in meaningless patterns. But he didn't open that photo again that night.
That weekend was Tuan's wedding, Khai's close friend since college. Khai arrived early, helped set up tables, took photos with old friends. The atmosphere was lively, music playing from the speakers, laughter mixing with the clink of glasses. Lynn, Khai's girlfriend, wore a pale blue dress, staying by his side the whole evening, occasionally leaning in to whisper teasing comments about the bride and groom. Lynn's perfume drifted faintly through the air, mixing with the smell of fresh flowers decorating the hall, the smell of food from the buffet table, the smell of wine in glasses sparkling under the warm yellow lights. Everything was alive, human, ordinary. Tuan came over to Khai mid-party, holding a glass of wine, face flushed pink from light drinking, grinning wide. "You know, weddings cost a fortune. I'm a little tight on cash right now, Khai." Khai laughed, patted his friend's shoulder. "Call me if you need anything. Don't be shy." Tuan laughed loudly, nodded, then got pulled away to take photos with his wife's relatives. Mid-party, Lynn leaned close to Khai's shoulder, asking quietly, "Hey, what's that strange smell at your place lately? Like damp paper. I noticed it when I stopped by the other day." Khai frowned, trying to remember. He hadn't noticed any smell before. "Probably from those old boxes sitting in the storage room too long," he said, then laughed, pulling Lynn onto the dance floor as the next song began. The following Wednesday night, around 1 in the morning, Khai's phone began buzzing non-stop on the nightstand. Hundreds of notifications, lighting the screen up repeatedly in the dark bedroom like a strobing flash. Khai jolted awake, grabbed his phone. The system reported a severe network failure. Thousands of automatic disbursement requests were being sent out continuously, all converging on a single name in the system. The single mother who had borrowed money to treat her child's illness weeks earlier. Khai jumped up, ran downstairs to his office, opened his laptop, trying to log into the main system to shut down the server. His fingers clattered across the keyboard urgently. The screen filled with red error lines running continuously. Then he heard it. Tick. A small sound from the corner of the room. Khai didn't turn around right away. He was focused on typing commands to disconnect the server. Tick. Again, steadier than before. He slowly turned his head. In the corner of the room, where he had placed the black notebook on a small shelf weeks earlier, something was leaking. A thick stream of liquid, dark red bordering on brownish black under the weak light from the computer screen, was seeping out from between the pages of the notebook, even though the rusted padlock remained intact, still sealed shut as before. Tick, tick. Khai rose from his chair, stepped slowly closer, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his own ears. The smell in the room changed. A sharp metallic tang, rusted iron mixed with old copper, growing stronger the closer he got to the notebook. He reached out, touched the drop of liquid that had just fallen onto the wooden desk. Cold. Cold enough that his finger went numb instantly, as if he'd just touched ice. When he brought his finger close to his nose, the smell of rotting paper rose thick and heavy, the smell of pages that had died dry long ago. Behind him, the computer screen let out a loud beep. The system had successfully disconnected, but the ticking sound from the notebook continued. Khai backed away, stepped backward out of the room, closed the door, stood gasping in the dark hallway.
The next morning, Khai drove to his parents' house, his mind still heavy from the night before. He sat at the breakfast table, just looking at his father for a long moment before speaking. "Dad, did grandfather ever run into trouble with the business?" Khai's father set down his chopsticks. The silence lasted long enough for Khai to realize it wasn't silence from confusion. "Why are you asking suddenly?" "I found some strange things in the storage room. An old notebook, locked, can't open it." His father sighed, stood up, walked out to the porch, lit a cigarette despite having quit years ago. Khai followed, stood beside him. "Back then, people used to say your grandfather got involved in something. A family that borrowed money, couldn't pay it back. The whole family took their own lives. Dad doesn't know if it's true either. It was a long time ago, before I was even born." His father's voice dropped lower, eyes looking distantly toward the road in front of the house. "Don't go digging up old stories, son. Just run things honestly. Don't push anyone too hard. That's enough." Khai nodded, said nothing more, but in his heart, that story had already taken root, growing into an unease he couldn't shake off. He stayed a few more days, trying to keep his rhythm of life normal, telling himself it was only unverified rumor. But every night, he heard the faint echo of ticking, steady, drifting through his broken sleep. 5 days later, the police called Khai. The voice on the other end was calm, asking routine questions about a client who had borrowed money through his app. Someone just reported missing. Khai pulled up the system to check, typed in the username the police provided. The account was registered under a stranger's name, but the phone number attached to it looked chillingly familiar. It was Tuan's number. Khai called his friend immediately. Long rings, no answer. He called Tuan's wife next. Her voice trembled from the very first word. "He left for work this morning. He's still not back. His phone's been off all day. I'm really scared." Khai stood frozen in the middle of his office, phone still pressed to his ear,
long after the call had ended. This was no longer his grandfather's story. His own system, built and expanded by his own hands, proudly shown to his father, was now directly causing harm to his closest friend. A wave of panic surged through Khai's chest, thick and suffocating, different from the vague fear of previous nights. He bolted out of the office, ran straight to the shop, raced down to the storage room, searching for the key to the black notebook. He tore through every drawer, every old box, throwing things to the floor without care, breath ragged, hands trembling so badly he knocked over a stack of old ledgers. No key anywhere.
Khai stood amid the chaos, gasping, looking around desperately. His eyes landed on a small hammer sitting in an old toolbox in the corner of the storage room. He picked up the notebook, set it on the wooden table, raised the hammer, aimed at the rusted padlock. Clang! The sound of metal striking metal rang out in the narrow storage room, echoing off the walls, sharp in the absolute silence around it. The lock didn't break on the first strike. Khai hit it again, twice more, each strike accompanied by a ragged breath, almost a sob. On the fourth strike, the lock shattered, small fragments of rusted metal scattering across the table. Khai stopped, looked at the now exposed lock core. Inside wasn't ordinary steel bolt mechanism like he expected. It was hair. Human hair, dry and brittle, dark and nearly rotted, wound tightly around the lock's core in multiple coils, thick enough to almost completely cover the metal inside. As though someone, long ago, had deliberately used hair, their own or someone else's, to seal the notebook shut, to keep what was inside from ever being touched again. Khai swallowed hard, trembling hands reaching out to unwind each strand from the lock core. They were brittle, breaking easily as though dried out over decades, crumbling into fine dust on his fingertips. He opened the cover. The first page held a long list, written in neat handwriting. The ink faded with time but still legible. Names, dates, loan amounts, interest rates. He flipped through page after page, and the deeper he went, certain names carried a red ink slash across them. A red so fresh, it looked as though it had just been drawn, unlike the faded ink of the rest of the page. Khai counted. 5 names marked with red. A family of 4, and one name standing alone. He turned to the final page of the notebook. The handwriting here was completely different. Shaky, scrawled, written as though in a state of utter panic. In places, the pen had pressed hard enough to tear the paper. They will come back to collect. I can't sleep anymore. Don't let my children, my grandchildren, do this work. Khai sank into his chair, both hands clutching his head, the notebook still open on the table before him. The ticking sound began again, this time not from the notebook itself, but seeming to come from the air around him, from every direction at once. Khai's head dropped onto the desk, exhausted, and he fell asleep right there in his chair. In the dream, he found himself standing in a long hallway, old photo frames lined along both walls, each face in the frames seeming to turn and follow him as he walked. At the far end of the hallway, a figure stood very far away. He jolted awake before the figure could draw any closer, cold sweat soaking through the back of his shirt, heart pounding hard. He sat up straight, breathing heavily, trying to steady himself. Then he realized the storage room wasn't as quiet as he'd assumed. In the darkest corner, where the yellow light didn't reach, 4 shapes stood there. Not clearly defined, hazy as though formed from thick smoke,
holding a fragile human shape that could dissolve at any moment. One tall, one slightly shorter beside it, and two smaller shapes standing between the two larger ones. A family. Khai held his breath, not daring to move. He waited for something to happen, but nothing happened. The four shapes simply stood still, facing toward him. Though he couldn't make out specific features, Khai could feel clearly that they were looking directly at him, unblinking, unmoving, making no sound at all. That silence stretched on, and somehow felt more frightening than any scream could have. They didn't come closer, didn't threaten, just stood there, as though waiting for him to understand something. Khai didn't take his eyes off the four shapes in the corner. He sat still, letting the silence stretch, until the first light of dawn crept through the small window above, and the four shapes faded slowly, dissolving into the air like morning mist meeting sunlight. He stood up, still trembling, and returned to the notebook on the table. A page near the middle held an old address, written beneath the name of the family of four marked in red. His grandfather's handwriting, cold and brief, noting only, House 14, Old Bak Mai Alley, repossessed. Khai drove there the moment the sky had fully brightened. The house sat deep within a narrow alley, abandoned for years. An iron gate, rusted, secured by an old chain so loose, Khai only needed to push gently for the gate to swing open, creaking long and low. Inside, wild grass grew knee-high, covering a path that had once been laid with tile. A two-story house, walls streaked with green moss, several window panes shattered long ago. Khai stepped inside, called Tuan's name, his voice ringing out and fading into the empty space. He found his friend in a corner of the ground floor room, what had once been the living room. Tuan sat huddled in the corner, his back against a wall where the plaster had peeled away in large patches. His clothes were caked with dirt, hair disheveled. Khai rushed over, knelt beside him, called his friend's name. Tuan turned to look at him, but his eyes were empty, as if looking through Khai into some space behind him. Tuan's 10 fingertips were raw red, skin peeled away, a few spots faintly bleeding. In his hand, he held an ancient bronze coin, its surface worn smooth, most of its engraving rubbed away. Tuan was using the edge of the coin to scratch at the earthen wall, producing a continuous, steady sound, like a rhythm that never stopped. Scratch, 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 scratch. Khai grabbed his friend's hand, trying to hold it still, but Tuan kept struggling against him, continuing to scratch at the wall, mouth muttering the same phrase over and over, voice flat, emotionless, like a tape stuck on loop. Pay it back in full. Pay it back in full. Pay it back in full. Khai looked up at the wall where Tuan had been scratching. There, beneath the fresh scratches, were older marks, faded with time but still visible. Drawings of 4 people, crude, childlike lines standing together, holding hands. Someone had drawn them here a very long time ago. Khai wrapped his arms around Tuan, pulling him to his feet, nearly having to drag him out of the room as Tuan kept twisting back to look at the wall, hand still clenched around the coin, refusing to let go. On the drive home, Tuan slowly came back to himself, though he couldn't remember clearly what had happened. He only said, voice still shaking, that someone had been calling his name all through the night, a very quiet voice, very close, as though whispering right next to his ear, though no one was there. Khai understood. This wasn't forgiveness. This was one final warning.
Khai brought Tuan home safely, handing him over to his wife, then drove straight to the office, without resting, without eating. He took out the black notebook one last time, placed it inside an old metal basin in the backyard of the office. His hands shook as he struck a match from an old matchbox. The small flame caught the corner of the notebook, slowly spreading, licking across page after page. Smoke rose thick and black, carrying the smell of burning paper, mixed with that familiar sharp metallic scent he'd smelled so many times over the past weeks. As the flames reached the middle of the notebook, a strange sound rose from within the fire. Not the usual crackle of burning paper, but something like a very faint, drawn-out sigh, fading away into nothing. Khai stood watching the notebook burn to ash, not looking away until the last flame finally died out. The next morning, he sat down at his computer and deleted the entire predatory lending system he had spent months carefully building. He called each client still in debt, one by one, starting with the single mother who had borrowed money to treat her child's illness. "You don't need to pay it back," Khai said over the phone, his voice tired but firm. "Consider that debt cleared." The line went quiet for a moment. Then came the sound of a choked sob, repeated thanks spilling out. That night, for the first time in weeks, Khai heard no ticking sound in his office. But when he turned off the light, preparing for bed, he glanced toward the corner of the room out of habit. The four shapes were still there, fainter than before, more transparent than before, but not yet completely gone. They didn't come closer. They simply stood still, as though watching, as though waiting to see whether Khai's promise was real. Months passed. Khai closed down the lending business entirely, returning the shop to its traditional pawnshop roots, running it small but honest, the way his father had always asked him to. Tuan slowly recovered, though he still woke sometimes in the middle of the night, and unconsciously rubbing at his fingertips where the scratches had been, long since healed. Khai no longer saw the four shapes in the corner of the room, no longer heard the ticking sound late at night. But there was one thing he never told anyone, not even Lin. On rainy nights, when his office sank into darkness and only the steady sound of rain fell outside the window, sometimes he still heard a very faint sound. The sound of paper, pages turning back and forth very softly, as though someone sat somewhere in the dark, leafing through an invisible notebook. Khai was never certain whether he had truly been forgiven, or whether they were simply waiting to see how long he could keep his promise before coming to collect once more. He only knew that each time he heard that sound of paper, he would get up, walk down to the office, check once more that he hadn't touched anyone else's debt, anyone else's suffering. And then the sound of paper would fall silent again, until the next rainy night.